Alright guys, I'm back, and no camera since it might be in the way of the pages. So this is basically the climate change concern intersecting with women's rights and feminism. Um, Hold on, some annoying car going by. So as we will see, um, or as we read already in those past articles, there's not really a connection to people, but as much as it is to what we're being given by capitalism and the you know the everyday activity from our industrial society. Um, Anyways, let's begin. Introduction: Women as sexual stewards. One fine day in the spring of 2009, I found myself in Berkeley, California art gallery for a Sierra Club sponsored wine and cheese reception. The event was called Sex and Sustainability, and it featured presentations by Sierra Club staffers, activists, partners, and local professor, all focused on global population growth, family planning, and the environment. At the time, the global population was well over 6 billion people. We would hit the 7 billion mark 2 years later, and climate change activists and policymakers had long been frustrated with the U.S. reluctance to join the global population community in aggressively combating climate change. Meanwhile, the pace of climate change was relentless. Floods, melting glaciers, sea level rise, and threats to wildlife claimed newspaper headlines every week. These weren't just environmental impacts. Reported human death tolls in the tens of thousands from intense storms, heat waves, and droughts found their way into the evening news, illustrating climate change's deadly threat in frightening ways. However, the reception was upbeat. Barack Obama had been elected president several months prior, ushering in a new era of hope that the U.S. would both increase funding commitments for international family planning as well as enact binding climate change legislation. The Sierra Club facilitator gave a speech drawing a seamless line of connection between women's fertility, population growth, and environmentalism. Quote, "Poor women all over the world are having babies in record numbers, with disastrous impacts on their health and the health of their families and the environment," end quote, she argued. We, the mostly student crowd in the room, had an important part to play in making a difference by signing up for the Sierra Club's Population Environment Program (GPEP) mailing list and connecting to information on various legislative initiatives. Quote, "We have to empower women globally, advance access to hold on. Advance access to voluntary family planning, advocate for sexuality and reproductive health education, work to reduce consumption, and support the campaign for international family planning. Oh, and write to Obama," end quote. What? Okay. Her words highlighted the issue that is central to this book, namely the return of global population to prominence in environmental debates, particularly in the context of climate change. Type climate change and birth control or family planning into your Google search bar, and an endless array of articles proclaiming that climate solving benefits of contraceptives comes back. Curiously, a number of these articles claim that this solution is new and innovative or so shrouded in taboo that no one is talking about it. However, this could not be further from the truth. Neo-Malthusians, people who view population growth as the main driver of environmental, social, and economic problems, have been making these arguments for decades, blaming human numbers for everything from deforestation to air pollution, global poverty, civil unrest, international migration, and now climate change. This is a long, enduring narrative that permeates ecological science, international development, and everyday conversations about the environment. What is relatively new is the way women's empowerment is being linked to these debates. Population advocates argue that harnessing American foreign aid to provide poor women around the world with universal voluntary access to contraceptives empowers them to make decisions about their childbearing in ways that affirm their human rights while benefiting the environment by decreasing human numbers. In this schema, fewer people will consume resources and use polluting technologies, relieving pressure on the Earth and its atmosphere, which are already being catastrophically stretched to their limits by destructive human activities. While these activities project population control because its historical association with coercion and human rights abuses, they do maintain that population growth makes environmental and social problems worse, and that their solutions will be easier to achieve if population growth is stabilized. The distinction, while subtle, is important. Population advocacy arises historically from the deployment of neo-Malthusians, an expansion of set of ideas developed in the late 18th century by British cleric and political economist Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus postulated a theory of the exponential growth of human populations, comparing it to the more limited growth of food production and arguing that human growth far outpaces the Earth's capacity to maintain the necessary conditions to sustain human life, leading to inevitable famine and widespread misery. Malthusianism is a political economic concept couched in the language of biological fundamentalism. Malthus was writing at the time of recent rapid growth in Britain, primarily among the poor. Debates about state aid to impoverished people were ubiquitous, and Malthus developed his ideas to make a case for why British authorities should remove the state-supported food aid provided to the poor via the British Poor Laws. However, he articulated the problems of population growth and the Earth's capacity as functions of nature, describing them as natural law, universal, and unchanging. 20th century neo-Malthusian proponents updated this theory, using it to explain environmental degradation writ large, including everything from toxic air, soil, and water pollution to deforestation, species extinction, soil erosion, and most recently climate change. They continue to posit these problems as biological, a natural function and result of human population growth. However, population advocates today reject Malthus' ideas, at least some of them do. One could argue that their position is more closely aligned with what Angus and Butler refer to as populationism. Like neo-Malthusians, populationists attribute social and ecological ills to human numbers. End quote. Um, However, they reject coercive population control and demographic targets and support rights-based solutions, including voluntary access to contraception, access to education, and income generating opportunities for women and girls worldwide. Populationism suggests that one can uphold Malthus and his followers' central claim that there are natural limits to the Earth's ability to sustain human life and that human numbers threaten those limits and must be decreased, while also supporting human rights and international development solutions as the right strategies to slow growth. This populationist perspective is at the heart of the population advocacy today. In the words of many advocates I spoke to, family planning programs offer a win-win solution for women, population, and the environment. But is it that simple? Are there actual differences between neo-Malthusian and populationist perspectives in terms of how they frame women's relationships to nature, the environment, and reproduction? If so, how do these values shape the kinds of advocacy that develop the partners they engage and the outcomes they seek? Making sexual stewards. When population and environment advocates talk about women in workshops and other messaging campaigns, they are constructing an idealized model of a woman, a moral agent who manages her fertility and the environment responsibly for the greater good. She is a modern woman who wants two or fewer children, engage in monogamous sexual relationships within the context of marriage, always uses contraceptives consistently and correctly, and makes childbearing decisions in concert with environmental values, including responsible limited consumption of energy and natural resources. This is a neoliberal concept, a symbol of ideal woman framed within the logic of private individual decision making and choice, who adopts a modicum of embodied environmental responsibility in the service of global developmental goals, and who helps advocate weave together narratives of the urgency of simultaneously addressing climate change and empowering women around the world to use contraceptives. She is what I refer to as the sexual steward, and she is vital to the future of international family planning policy. The sexual steward is exemplified in countless reports and articles linking population climate change and social justice. Take, for example, a quote from a report produced by World Watch Institute. Quote, women and children in poverty are among the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change, despite their disproportionately low contribution to the problem. Removing the obstacles that would hold more than 3 billion potential agents of change, women and girls, is both pragmatic and necessary. The obstacles that the report is referring to are reproductive, and the report postulates that removing them will not only improve women's social status, it will potentially solve problems for the entire world. Quote, I mean, if it's trying to like prevent incest, like poor women might need it too. So I don't want to keep hearing this strict bent of you know urgency and uh, skepticism, but I am too, and I'm on board with that. It's just I don't always want to be like worried about contraceptives being given to the poor because again, there's no way else to talk about this other than it's possible that they need it too. Okay, quote, the resulting growth and other benefits supporting women's efforts to manage their own lives and improving their status will in turn elevate the well-being of all other world's populations will with Earth's climate representing one aspect of this. And the most effective way to do all this is by making sure, to the extent possible, that women and men everywhere realize their own childbearing intentions, including timing, spacing, and number of children. End quote. Okay, hold on. This text encapsulates the sexual stewardship idea. Women are assumed to be fertile, reproducing beings whose improved status will ideally lead to making responsible family choices. Choices that include the proper spacing, timing, and number of children that will slow population growth. Linking these decisions and behaviors to climate change places women's individual reproductive lives in global context. Women's childbearing decisions are thus never individual, never free from the weight of potential environmental catastrophe, and thus never free from a duty to reproduce responsibly. In addition, women in this model are a monolith, sexually active, heterosexual, able to become pregnant and bear children, and free to make their own bodily choices, free of coercion or violence. As I discovered at the reception described at the start of this chapter, sexual stewards are not just a product of institutional developmental actors, they also arise from youth activism. Consider the policy statement developed and circulated by youth advocates at the International Climate Change meetings in Cancun in 2010. Quote, climate change disproportionately affects women, especially young women who are often the stewards of their area's natural resources as they must walk further to collect water, work harder to produce crops from dry soil, and cope with drought, flooding, other natural resources, and disease. At the same time, empowered women can be particularly strong agents for sustainable change in their communities. An effective approach to climate change mitigation and adaptation must support young people's sexual and reproductive health and rights, SRHR, as doing so is essential for adaptation while contributing to reducing the impact of future climate change. Yeah, I can see them doing this, linking this. That's really messed up. Alright. Linking environmental problems to women's agency through responsible reproductive management is, apparently, the wave of the future, and the people at the heart of the narrative are young people. In this book, I argue that sexual stewardship was created to address international development sector in crisis. Population has been a troubled issue for decades. Decreased funding, histories of coercion, racism, and human rights abuses, and the lack of attention among the broader public have eroded support for what was once a very popular topic of the discussion in the U.S. in the mid 20th century. Population growth was front and center in environmental activism and had strong ties in the mainstream women's reproductive rights movement. However, as evidence of international and domestic coercion increasingly came in light, coalescing with the conservative political and religious backlash against family planning in the 1980s, population lost its place in the sun in development circles. In the 1980s, transnational feminists organized to offer the international policy community a new way of addressing family planning, emphasizing women's empowering through voluntary access to contraceptives within broader programs supporting women's SRHR in the human rights framework. This approach is the foundation of sexual stewardship. Sexual stewardship also rests on instrumental approaches, using technological solution contraceptives to address the complex social, political, and economic drives of population growth, as well as to build the base of science and activism to support international family planning policy. When women's fertility and reproduction is lifted out of the social context of entrenched poverty, gender inequality, and growing wealth and income inequality, inadequate access to comprehensive health care, education services, employment opportunities, and cultural norms favoring large families, it is easy to imagine women as freely acting, autonomous agents whose enduring high fertility is individually driven. In development circles, this model is an attractive way to build a base of new advocates, specifically young environmental advocates, as well as to maintain support from those who might otherwise have abandoned the issue of population. Given that it rests on such long enduring ideas, is sexual stewardship new? In some ways it is. Gone is the long familiar 20th century language of population control through which imminent, quote, global famine, death, and destruction signaled the need for top-down, demographically driven intervention programs. This language has been replaced by focus on women's rights, justice, and affirmation of the importance of volunteerism to the success of family planning programs. As many population and environment advocates would agree, today's focus on women's reproductive rights and justice evinces a clear break from the so-called dark past of population control and cements a decades-long shifting of population concerns into the realm of progressive politics. However, sexual stewardship is in line with a host of neoliberal development strategies focused on population. One such strategy aims to capitalize on the, quote, demographic dividend produced in key phase of nation's demographic transition from high to low population growth. Theorists describe the demographic dividend as an opportunity that arises when, in a transition from high birth and death rates to low ones, the relative proportion of adults in the labor force is high compared to their dependents. The birth dearth really does talk about this actually. Anyways, their financial resources are more available for investment in family and the economy, leading to per capita income growth. This is the first dividend. The second potential dividend comes in the form of increasing longevity of elderly populations. When a concentrated older population accumulates and invests their assets, leading to increased national income. In other words, when there is a high proportion of working age people relative to the number of dependents, production can increase relative to the consumption and GDP per capita may increase. These gains are not automatic. There must be productive workers and consumers, and governments must minimize the opportunities of the population growth window by investing in education, healthcare, and neoliberal economic policies favoring job markets and future pension programs. Family planning is central to the demographic dividend strategy in that it slows birth rates and frees workers from responsibilities in the domestic sphere, allowing them to invest more in the formal economy. This approach has gained traction among the international family planning community. and has been included in reports written by World Health Organization and UN Population Program. However, they promote the demographic dividend as a counterpoint to the youth bulge concept, arguing that the youthful demographic dividend must be managed in order to be productive and peaceful. Otherwise, if not properly supported, it could manifest as a violent bulge of young people, usually supported. It could manifest as a violent bulge if not properly supported. It could manifest as a violent bulge of young people, usually men, that threaten global geopolitical security. These concerns mirror mid 20th century Cold War anxieties about the spread of communism among rapidly growing populations in the global south. At the time, U.S. government leaders, economic planners, and military officials all postulated that slowing population growth in global south nations um, through artificial means, Western contraception was necessary to their economic modernization, as well as to global political stability. The contrasting narratives of demographic dividend and bulge directly rehearsed these old discourses, shaping the way young people access reproductive services. As Hendrickson demonstrates, in the absence of fuller understandings of young people's sexuality and reproduction within the broader context of their lives, dividend versus bulge discourses actually constrain young people's access to sexual and reproductive health services, particularly young men. In this project, I explore the context in which the sexual stewardship model arose, why it continues to gain in popularity, particularly among college-age environmental activists, and what possibilities it holds for social justice organization in the future. Taking the concept of sexual stewardship as my point of departure, my aim is to offer a new way to think about recent population environmental advocacy and its newest iteration, population climate advocacy. This advocacy is not comprised of strategies supporting population control, but rather those designed to reframe population interventions as progressive, socially just, and attractive to a new crop of younger environmentalists. In exploring these strategies, I focus on three key trends: recent efforts to build scientific knowledge linking population growth and climate change, making a case for contraceptive interventions from a scientific perspective, the role of private donors behind the scenes, and non government organizations, NGOs, efforts to enroll young youth as population advocates. In particular, I focus my anthropographic observations on new defunct training program created by the Sierra Club, known as the Population Environmental Program. The GPEP was designed to develop a new generation of global population policy advocates through upbeat approaches linking youthful energy, the language of women's empowerment and justice, and policy relevant science. Okay, there was this one abortion article I saw actually that did say something about population and environment act. So I guess this is real, and I have seen that, so that's weird. Um, this book has three main arguments. First, I argue that the science plays an important role in population climate advocacy, one that functions to legitimize advocates' work and minimize controversy. The more scientific studies that are produced to demonstrate linkages between population growth and climate change, the more effectively the political underpinnings of this argument are obscured. Yet, scientific knowledge is never produced in a vacuum. The cultural beliefs of the day, prevailing scientific paradigms, and funding opportunities and constraints all play a significant role in shaping which scientific questions are answered and which our problems are pursued. In many ways, this project demonstrates the impossibility of understanding the population environment of population climate science outside the context of politics, because the perception of demography, ecology, atmospheric sciences, and other quantitative sciences is that they are objective, rational, and value free. The ease with which political values are embedded in science makes this arena of advocacy attractive to political advocates. Hmm. Yeah, being totally data brained instead of looking at things like a normal person, I guess. Yeah, true. You lose out on the empathy, maybe. Okay. In bringing these values to the surface, my aim is not to expose evidence of bad science. Rather, it is to interrogate the ways politics are deeply entrenched with scientific paradigms operating largely behind the scenes. Second, I argue that populationism is largely growing in popularity because its appeal to young people who are attracted to the neoliberal language of individual choices and consumer actions as solutions to large scale environmental problems. This approach infuses how young activists understand the concept of women's empowerment. It is action oriented and facilitated through environmental access to contraceptives based on narratives of individual personal responsibility. These framings are key drivers of young people's desire to be population advocates as well. The narrative of the individual action-oriented development actor infused trainings that construct youth advocates as development experts and leaders on the global scale. The private consumer choice model is so pervasive as a part of American culture that it deeply informs our ideas about morality, individualism, and personal responsibility in a range of ways, including how we think about reproduction and environmentalism. Mm. Yeah, Ben Wattenberg would talk about like the greater scheme to get us to walk on our feet for them or to vote on our feet for them. But yeah, while the young activist I interviewed proclaimed the broad social values such as women's empowerment and reproductive justice are their primary motivations for their advocacy, I demonstrate throughout the book that what actually resonates with them most is neoliberal activist model focused on individualism. Third, the most important, the term social justice seems to be losing its meaning, drawing on language and strategies rooted in civil rights activism. A wide range of social actors describe the work as social justice oriented. This has been an effective and attractive rallying cry for young people who are leading major movements on issues ranging from racial justice, Black Lives Matter, to wealth inequality, Occupy movement. However, the vagueness and lack of precision of the term has led many of other kinds of advocates, including those representing conservative right wing social movements, to adopt this language, from the Tea Party to the pro life movement. As this terminology becomes diluted, anyone can lay claim to it, including populationists whose advocacy has uncomfortable historical resonance with population control. In so doing, they potentially undermine the work of more radical movements that truly support reproductive justice by challenging the structures of inequality that have shaped reproductive politics historically and continue to do so today. Population and climate change in development. From 2009 to the end of 2010, I followed a loosely assembled network of international development actors whose goal was to increase U.S. funding support for international family planning policy by emphasizing its benefits for climate change, SRHR, and poverty alleviation. They pursued this goal through workshops, advocacy training sessions, research reporting sessions, private meetings, and congressional lobbying visits. Members of the network came from a range of backgrounds. Some were donors at private philanthropic organizations or at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Others worked at NGOs, universities, or were simply volunteers in local communities or on college campuses. Some identified as feminists and reproductive health advocates, while others were almost entirely consumed by environmental concerns and saw the importance of women's reproductive health and rights as secondary. As one network member stated in an international review, oh, sorry, in an interview, quote, there is no one uniform movement. There are several streams of groups. Some are more concerned with demography, some family planning, some the Union of Environment and Reproductive Health Concerns, end quote. Despite this diversity, what held the network together was the belief that providing poor women in the global south with contraceptives will slow global population growth, and that this in turn slows the pace of greenhouse gas emissions and helps countries adapt to climate change, eventually benefiting us all. There are two key changes to this perspective. The first being that the countries that contribute the most greenhouse gases to the atmosphere every year are not those with the highest fertility rates. China, the US, Russia, India, and Japan emit the highest greenhouse gases, the gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. Every year, each one of these countries has low fertility rates measured at the number of children born per year over the course of her lifetime. The average woman in China gave birth to 1.5 children over the course of her lifetime. For US, India, Russia, Japan, the numbers are 1.8, 1.7, and 2.4, and 1.42 respectively. Compare these numbers with the countries' populations advocates focus on for their family planning advocacy efforts. High fertility countries in sub-Saharan Africa like Nigeria, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. In those countries, fertility rates are 5.6, 5, and 4.4 respectively, while their national greenhouse gas emissions don't even rank in the top 75.75. In fact, with the exception of South Africa, which has a fertility rate of 2.3, none of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa rate in the top 75 greenhouse gas emission nations. The second challenge is that fertility rates are coming down all over the world, and they have been for past 50 years or more, albeit eventually, according to 2015 report by United Nations that looked at data from 197 nations, that average woman worldwide has 2.5 children in their lifetime, a steep drop from rates of the past. Women in most parts of the world get married later, have fewer children, and access higher education at higher rates than ever before. At the same time, the report found in 2014 145 million women around the world had an unmet need for family planning, a measure of the number had an unmet need for family planning, a measure of the number of women who would like to delay or stop childbearing, who are sexually active but who are not using Western contraceptive. Not, yeah. In these figures, sub-Saharan Africa stands as an outlier, which is why the continent receives the lion's share of focus in population circles. Approximately half of women in sub-Saharan Africa who would like to access Western contraceptives report not having full access. Well, that's messed up. Wait, they want that? Okay. Yeah, that's... The region has the world's highest fertility rates, the lowest contraceptive coverage, and among the lowest ages at marriage. Okay, this is probably why they want that. What the hell? And you're just denying them this. Of course, I mean, that's our attitude over here. We love fucking child marriage, right? Anyways, these trends are changing though somewhat slowly. 50 years ago, the average woman in sub-Saharan Africa had 6.7 children compared with today's 5.1. In addition, these figures mask wide variation between countries on the continent, while fertility rates are impacted by religious and cultural diversity, poverty and social inequality, and uneven access to healthcare and education. As women access to education increases, along with the growing trend toward urbanization, fertility rates are expected to continue to decline across the continent. Average fertility rates across the continent are projected to reach 3.9 children per woman by 2030 and 3.1 children by 2050. The significance of African fertility trends must also be understood within the context of broader global discourses on population, particularly those framed throughout the language of crisis. If Western contraceptive use, replacement fertility, 2 children per couple, monogamous Married couples and educated working women in urban settings are the modern ideal, and development narratives discourses on Africans stand in sharp contrast to that. The continent is all too often reduced to narratives of endless failure, poverty, disease, war, and extreme inequality, described as always in need of Western intervention and salvation. Um, yeah, white savior, I guess. Sure. That's probably what some of them think. These racialized colonial narratives have long constructed Western imaginaries about the continent. Western societies have long viewed Africa as their radical other, a counterpoint to their own uh, construction of civilization, enlightenment, progress, development, modernity, and history. End quote. As novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie reminds us, circulating a single story of a place or a people is dangerous. The illusions and erasures required to create such a limited narrative not only re- reinforce enduring stereotypes, they also circumscribe the imagination of those who construct and maintain the narrative in ways that foreclose new knowledge and forms of engagement. These limitations directly shape understandings of African social, culture, and gender relations governing sex, fertility, and reproduction, locking the continent into static images of high fertility in a fixed, unending pattern of explosive growth. Part of the reason for this is because population climate narratives tend to uh, naturalize poverty, inequality in the global south. In advocacy trainings, images of the poor are presented as dark skinned women of color, often in tattered clothing and surrounded by children. While these images do reflect the lives of some women, they are also constructed representations, informed by colonial legacies that circumscribe Western audiences' understandings of the lives and experiences of those depicted. Yes, this is almost like the caste system, but another layer. It's like the simulation of what has happened is what they want you to expect. So even though these things have happened and are still happening, it's not inherent, and I don't think that it's there's nothing about the caste system that makes it you want to think that it's inherent. I mean, it's hard to talk about this right now because I feel like there's a meta to the caste system where, in general, we just stereotype people as like in need and always run down and destitute. And that's usually what we think of minorities. And that's not always the case. And so that's the caste system sort of having a meta. That's what I'm talking about. All right. Dogger's 2011 analysis of images used in international non government organizations, INGOs, advocacy, and fundraising materials demonstrates that depictions of racialized global south women are used to project universal values of motherhood and womanhood at the same time that they symbolize global south difference. Stylized images of women and children are particularly common in depictions of disaster, famine, environment, and grinding poverty, presenting visual narratives of women and families devoid of men in ways that represent women as vulnerable and needy. The roles as mothers are represented as universal and homogeneous, in contrast with missing men, whose absence can be read as either lack of family presence and responsibility, or worse, that missing men are the cause of women's vulnerability. These images of excessive fecundity, lack of stable male presence, and extreme poverty pathologize poor families while essentializing women's vulnerability. More importantly, they render women as always in need of, and in their vulnerability always deserving of, Western assistance. This is very true. I mean, obviously, for a while, women have depended on men. Um, Again, it's not always the case, but once you take that away, you get to then claim, oh, you need us now because women initially weren't really like homogeneously, I would say, marriage and heterosexuality was the key factor in the system. And so once things started to change, I guess, it we could blame optically what it looks like on the neoliberal woman and say that they need men, when obviously nowadays that's not the case, but any struggles, any financial struggle, any, even simple stuff that you may need a strong person for that's nearby, like, you know, mechanics being assumed to be men and the woman just looks vulnerable. Like, I assume any situation like that is just assumed as like, oh, they need men. Alright. Even if there's a truth to that, it's still like, it's not inherent. Alright. As African feminist Everjoyce Wynne argues, the image of the African woman as, quote, always poor, powerless, and invariably pregnant, burdened with lots of children, or carrying one load or another on her back or her head, is a favorite image, one which we have to associate with development. Like the fly-infested and emaciated black child that is often used by international news agencies, the barefooted African woman sells. Without her uttering a word, this woman pulls in financial resources. End quote. While this image proliferates, the alternative images are obscured, particularly those of the rapidly growing urbanized African middle classes. In rendering class diversity invisible, the needs and the desires of middle class African women are erased, foreclosing opportunities for development policies that address gender inequality across class lines. Iro- oh, sorry. Ironically, similar images of women of color in the U.S. historically accomplished just the opposite. Prior to the mid 1960s, American news media represented poverty in images of white families, primarily in Appalachia. However, in two-year period from 1965 to 1967, these images became dramatically darker, with images of African Americans coming to dominate the face of poverty and end quote in the news, while poverty rates remained stable. This dramatic shift was facilitated by a change in moral tone through which poverty was described as converged as coverage of the poor was presented in a more critical light and narratives of the undeserving poor proliferated. Images of African Americans as representative of the poor flourished as well. Alright, that's it for now. I will see you guys